Hi, grade 12. So today's session is about responding to the environment in humans. And as always, the department's guidelines are at the front, and all of these topics are covered in the session. I just want to say, because this is such a large chapter, I'm going to be splitting it into 3 sections. So the first section is going to be just the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, its disorder. So basically just this page over here. And then the next video will be about the human eye, and the video following that will be about the human ear. Okay, so humans have 2 systems that respond to the environment. And these two systems are the nervous system and the endocrine system. And why these 2 systems are the systems that respond to the environment is because these systems are basically messenger systems within your body. So the nervous system uses impulses to send messages from a sensory receptor to the brain and back to an effector, whereas the endocrine system uses hormones that are secreted in the blood and then go to specific target organs or glands that then also secrete things. It's more like a domino effect of secretions in the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is actually a chapter on its own that you learn later this year. I don't know, some of you might have already started with this. But you need to be able to differentiate between the nervous system and the endocrine system. In the nervous system, the responses are rapid, whereas in the endocrine system, the responses are slow. And this has been a question in past papers. So I suggest that you do learn this. So yeah, the responses are rapid and the responses are slow in the endocrine system. In the nervous system, electrical impulses are sent, whereas in the endocrine system, hormones are secreted. Then where and how are they transmitted? In the nervous system, impulses are sent through neurons, whereas in the endocrine system, it is sent through blood. So hormones are secreted into the blood. And then in the nervous system, the specific target organs are effectors, which are your muscles that contract or relax to bring about a specific action. So if you touch a hot plate, the impulse is sent to your, because it's a reflex action, it's going to go to your spine, and then the impulse is going to be sent back to your muscle to lift up your hand very quickly from the plate. And that is also why it's rapid, so that it can protect your body. And then in the endocrine system, the target organs are more glands and organs and tissues and cells. So that's the difference between the nervous system and the endocrine system. And then we need to know why the nervous system is necessary. So this is basically the function of the nervous system. So it's necessary because, number one, it detects changes in the internal and external environment, thus allowing the body to react to these changes. And these reactions try to ensure homeostasis. So you know homeostasis is the maintenance of a relatively constant environment. Relatively constant because there's a range of normal. So the body tries to keep this range of normal as far as possible, and the nervous system is what allows the body to do this. And then number 2, it also enables the coordination of various activities of the body. So your brain is what tells you to pick up a bottle or to walk left, right, you know. So it coordinates all of these activities in the body, not only voluntary activities like picking up a glass or walking, but also involuntary actions like your digestive system, how your stomach is digesting and then is passing through your intestines. The nervous system coordinates all of that. And then some reactions are involuntary and therefore they are rapid and reflexive. So like blinking is an involuntary action. It can be voluntary because you can force yourself to blink, but naturally, if you're not thinking about it, blinking is an involuntary action. So now we get to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system is made up of your brain and your spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of all of the nerves that extend outwards from your spinal cord. And part of the nervous system is the brain, and you need to know the brain's structure and its function, and then specifically the structure and function of each of the subsections of the brain. So if we start off by the structure of the brain, it is protected by the cranium, which is your skull. It's the bone that protects your brain. And then just underneath the cranium, there are 3 membranes called the meninges, and they also protect the brain. So a membrane is just like a little sheet that goes over the brain, and there are 3 of them. And they like asking in section A by the multiple choice questions or the give one word or the biological term for this description. They like asking about the meninges in that section. And then the hollow ventricles in the brain are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The ventricles of the brain are those little ridges in your brain. So you know the brain, I'll show you on the next slide now, when there's a picture of the brain. Those ventricles are little hollow, I almost want to call them like a valley, and in that valley there's some cerebrospinal fluid. And then the brain gives rise to 12 cranial nerves. And then the function of the brain. So the function of the brain is actually really easy because the function of the brain is made up of the functions of the subsections of the brain. So number 1, it receives and interprets all sensations. Number 2, it controls higher thought processes. Number 3, it controls voluntary and involuntary actions. Number 4, coordinates voluntary movements. And number 5, maintains muscle tone, balance, and equilibrium. Okay, so this is just to show you the difference between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So here is the central nervous system. It's your brain and your spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is all of the blue nerves coming out from the spinal cord. So here you can see brain and spinal cord is the central nervous system. Then ganglia nerves are the peripheral nervous system. They make up the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so now we get to the specific subsection parts of the brain. So you have the cerebrum, which is this whole big part up here. Then you get the cerebellum, which is this part over here. You get the medulla oblongata, which is this section here. And you get the corpus callosum, which is here. The hypothalamus is kind of somewhere here. It's not really shown on this picture, but it's a little gland. And then I said to you, I'd show you where the ventricles are, the ventricles that have the cerebrospinal fluid. So you have a big ventricle in this section over here. And then you have another ventricle over here, and they have cerebrospinal fluid in them. And it basically makes the brain a bit lighter. Okay, so the cerebrum, which is this whole part. Let's get a color. This whole part over here. All the way down here. So the cerebrum, the structure is, it is the largest part of the brain. As you can see, it goes all the way around here. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It has gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. The left and right hemispheres control the activities on the opposite sides of the body, and this crossing over takes place in the medulla oblongata. So here in the medulla oblongata is where the crossing over takes place. So it will cross over. The part of the right side of the body will be controlled by the left hemisphere of the brain, and the left side of the body will be controlled by the right side of the brain. And then the functions of the central nervous system. So it controls higher thought processes. It receives and interprets all 5 senses, so sight, hearing, touch, taste, and scent. So the cerebrum receives and interprets all those senses, and it also controls voluntary actions. Then we get this, the cerebellum, which is this whole part here. So let's use yellow for the cerebellum. So it's here. The cerebellum is situated behind the medulla oblongata. So we can see here's the front, and here's the back, here's the medulla oblongata, and it sits behind the medulla oblongata. It also has gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. And then the function of the cerebellum is it coordinates voluntary actions and maintains muscle tone, balance, and equilibrium. So now people ask, what's the difference between controls voluntary actions and coordinates voluntary actions? Well, there's a very big difference, because your cerebrum, let's say you want to pick up a glass. Your cerebrum is what tells you or sends out the impulse to your effector to pick up the glass. But the cerebellum is what coordinates the voluntary action. So it makes sure that you pick up the glass with the right amount of force, that you don't pick it up and throw the water out of the glass. So that is how the cerebellum coordinates voluntary action. So there's a difference between controls and coordinates. Then we get the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a bundle of nerve fibers, and it is over here. It's this whole part here. They also like asking, they'll label it or put a line there and ask you to label it in an exam. And they like asking, what is it and what does it do? So it's a bundle of nerve fibers, and it connects the 2 hemispheres of the brain. So, well, of the cerebrum specifically, because the cerebrum has the left and right hemispheres. So this bundle of nerve fibers is what connects the 2 hemispheres. Then we have the medulla oblongata. They also like asking you to label this in exams, and they like tricking you out or catching you out by putting a label here. The medulla oblongata stops here and starts here. So this over here is the pons. It is a gland, you don't need to know it. So that is the pons, and it bulges out like this. Just underneath where it bulges out is the medulla oblongata, which is this whole section here. So just underneath where the pons bulges out like that is where the medulla oblongata is situated. And then it stops here where there's this other little structure over here. And then they'll put a label here and ask you to name it, and then it's the spinal cord. So the spinal cord is continuous with the medulla oblongata, but it's called different things at different sections. So here's the medulla oblongata, and it's just underneath the pons, and just underneath the medulla oblongata is the spinal cord. Okay. So I'm just going to remove this label here. Okay. So the medulla oblongata continues as the spinal cord. It contains cerebrospinal fluid, and now it's different to the other structures. It has white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. So this is different to other structures. The cerebrum and the cerebellum had gray matter on the outside and white matter on the inside. But the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord have white matter on the outside and gray matter on the inside. And then its function is it contains reflex sensors for involuntary actions. It conducts impulses from the spinal cord to the brain and vice versa. And then the impulses cross from one side to the other as they pass through. That's a typo, sorry, it should be another essay. As they pass through the medulla oblongata. So like I said, here the spinal cord comes and then the messages cross here in the medulla oblongata. And that is how the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. Okay. And then the last one is the hypothalamus. It's a little gland over here, and it controls body temperature, blood pressure, appetite, thirst, emotion, and sleep. Okay, so like I said, the functions of the brain is very easy because it's very similar, or it's like basically directly tied to the functions of the subsections of the brain. So the cerebrum controls higher thought processes. Yeah, one of the functions of the brain is controls higher thought processes. It receives and interprets all five senses, receives and interprets all sensations. It controls voluntary actions. It controls voluntary and involuntary actions because of the medulla oblongata here contains reflex sensors for involuntary actions. Coordinates voluntary movements, which we said was different to controls, and the cerebellum coordinates the voluntary movements and then maintains muscle tone, balance, and equilibrium, and that's the cerebellum. So these two are solely the cerebrum, these two are the cerebellum, and this one is the cerebrum for controls voluntary and the medulla oblongata for controls involuntary actions. Okay, so very easy. Okay, so then we have the peripheral nervous system. So we already said the central nervous system is your brain and your spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system makes up all the nerves that extend outward from the spinal cord. And then, yeah, your peripheral nervous system is split up into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And then later, your autonomic nervous system is split up into the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay, so the somatic nervous system reacts to the external environment. It's all of the components of the nervous system that are going to detect changes in the external environment. So this is free nerve endings and your sense organs, which are your receptors. Sensory nerves that carry impulses from the receptors to the spinal cord or to the brain, and then the motor nerves that carry impulses from those areas, either the brain or the spinal cord, back to the effectors. And then it also includes the effectors, which are your skeletal muscles that bring about a change to ensure homeostasis is maintained when there are changes in the external environment. So it's going to be the muscle that pulls your hand away from the hot place. Then we have the autonomic nervous system. This reacts to the internal environment. Okay, it is made up of sensors in the brain and spinal cord, the nerve cells in smooth muscles. So smooth muscles are what make up your organs. And then it also includes the nerve cells in glands and internal organs. And then it also includes the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves running to the smooth muscles, glands, and internal organs. So your sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves work in opposition. One will do something to an organ or to a gland, and the other one will do the opposite. And there are nice photos on the internet that show you exactly what does what. But an example would be that your parasympathetic nerves constrict your pupil, and then the sympathetic nerves dilate the pupil. So they just work in opposition like that. Another example is your parasympathetic nerves decrease heart rate, whereas your sympathetic nerves increase the heart rate. So they literally work in opposition. They're antagonistic. Yeah, so it includes that, and then the function is to control subconscious activities to restore homeostasis. Not unconscious activities, subconscious activities, because you're not unconscious when these activities are taking place. They are just activities that you aren't thinking about, so they're involuntary. Okay, then we have the structure and functioning of a nerve. We have two different kinds of neurons. the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. How do you tell the difference between the two? The main difference is that the sensory neuron has the cell body on the side. And it's easy to remember that. Sensory, cell body, side. So it's alliteration. Sensory neuron has the cell body on its side. Whereas for motor neuron, the cell body is at the top and it's connected to the dendrites. Within the cell body is a nucleus and cytoplasm, mitochondria, all of the organelles that cells have. And then connected to it are dendrites, and the dendrites are what transmits the impulse from the cell body to the axon. So you have the axon down here that connects to the terminal branches. And around the axon, it's not really shown here, but it is on sensory neurons. There's a myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath goes around the neurolemma and the axon. So the myelin sheath protects the axon and helps speed up the transmission of impulses, and then it's connected to the terminal branches. The motor neuron carries impulses from the central nervous system to the effector, and the sensory neuron carries impulses from the receptor to the central nervous system. And I always remember the direction of an impulse is DCBA. So it's the opposite of ABCD, it's DCBA. Dendrites, cell body, axon. That's how it goes. Dendrites, cell body, axon. Okay, so this is just the functions of the nerves, so the specific parts of the neuron. So the dendrites, it transmits the impulse towards the cell body of the neuron. The cytoplasm, the substance for transmission of nerve impulses. The cell body, it contains mitochondria, ribosomes, and endoplasmic reticulum. And the cytoplasm is in the cell body. There's the myelin sheath that protects the axon, and it provides electrical insulation and speeds up the transmission of the impulse. And then the axon, it transmits the impulse away from the cell body of the neuron to the terminal branches. Okay, then we have the three different types of neurons. We have the sensory neuron, motor neuron, and an interneuron, also called a connector neuron. And this is found in the brain in the spinal cord, where the sensory neuron connects on this side and the motor neuron connects on that side, or vice versa. But it's basically whenever there's a transfer from the sensory part to the motor part, there's an interneuron or connector neuron between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron. And then this just senses the stimulus, it's the response to the stimulus, and found in the brain and spinal cord between the two. All of this we have already said already, so you can read through it if you want to, but it has been said already. Okay, then you need to know what a synapse is. And a synapse occurs between the terminal branches of one neuron and the dendrites of the next. So here you can see this part here is the synapse. So here is, we'll call these the terminal branches of the one neuron, and these are the dendrites of another neuron. And just between them, there's this really tiny microscopic gap called a synapse. And synaptic contact is communication of the impulses across the synapse by means of chemical neurotransmitters. So we know impulses along a neuron are in an electrical form, but across this little gap between the two neurons, they turn into a chemical impulse. So in the synapse, it is a chemical impulse because chemical neurotransmitters transfer the impulse. As soon as it gets to the dendrites of the next neuron, it changes back to an electrical impulse. So this is basically the flow of it. There's a receptor that receives the stimulus. The neuron transfers this stimulus as an electrical impulse. Across the synapse between the terminal branches of the one neuron and the dendrites of the other neuron, the impulse becomes a chemical impulse due to the chemical neurotransmitters. And then when it gets back to the other neuron, transfers to the other neuron, it becomes an electrical impulse again, and this transfers it to the central nervous system. Okay, then we have a reflex arc. So you must be able to differentiate between what a reflex action is and what a reflex arc is. So a reflex action is a quick, automatic action that involves the spinal cord and does not involve the brain. It is an important function to protect the body from harm. And why it doesn't involve the brain is it bypasses the brain by going straight to the spinal cord, because that is a shorter path to take. It's quicker, so it's to protect the body from harm. If you touch a hot plate, you don't want the impulse to take long by going all the way to the brain and back. You'd rather bypass the brain, just go to the spinal cord and back, so it's quick and you can quickly lift up your hand so that you don't get bad burn wounds. So in this way, it protects the body. The reflex arc is this path taken by this impulse. So across the sensory neuron to the spinal cord and back by the motor neurons to bring about a response to a stimulus during a reflex action. So reflex action is the actual action that you do. You touch a hot place and you lift up your hand quickly. The reflex arc is the path taken along which the impulse is transmitted. Okay, so you must be able to tell the difference between the two. Okay, now this is a reflex arc because it's showing the whole path taken. Okay, so number one, the heat receptors in the skin receive the stimulus of heat and convert it into an impulse. So receptors receive the stimulus of heat and convert it into an impulse. And now, number two, because it is an impulse, the sensory neuron can conduct this nerve impulse through the dorsal root. So this part here is the dorsal root. This part here is the ventral root. Dorsal means back, ventral means forward. So the sensory neuron comes in at the back of the spinal cord and the motor neuron leaves from the front of the spinal cord. So the sensory neuron comes in through the dorsal root, and then it comes across, it makes synaptic contact with the connector neuron, which makes synaptic contact with the motor neuron. So here's your connector neuron. And then here it makes synaptic contact with the motor neuron. And it goes all the way down. The impulses are conducted by the motor neuron out of the spinal cord towards the muscles of your hand, which act as effectors. And then the effector contracts to pull the hand away from the flame. This is your vertebra, the V and the V, and this part here is your spinal cord. So here's your spinal cord that's running through the vertebra, and it's a cross section. So you're looking at a cross section of the vertebra and the spinal cord. So the sensory neuron comes in through the dorsal root, and this is a ganglion. It's just a little bulge. So that is how you can identify which side is a sensory neuron and which side is the motor neuron. The sensory neuron has this bulge called the ganglion because you can see there that the sensory neuron cell body is on its side, so it needs to make this little bulge to make space for that cell body. Whereas the motor neuron does not have a cell body on its side, so it doesn't need a ganglion. Okay, so the sensory neuron comes through the dorsal root, makes synaptic contact with the connector neuron, which makes synaptic contact with the motor neuron that leaves the spinal cord all the way back to the effector to bring about the reflex action. Then we get to the disorders of the central nervous system, and there are two of them that you must know. Number one is Alzheimer's disease, and number two is multiple sclerosis. So Alzheimer's disease is when your brain wastes away, and this means that your brain is physically becoming smaller because the brain matter is degenerating. So slowly over time, your brain is basically losing some matter, and this is causing harm to the subsections of your brain that control different things, like your cerebrum controls your higher thought processes, like memory and rational thinking, and because it's being wasted away, because it's degenerating, it leads to memory loss and confusion. And then the second disorder is multiple sclerosis. So we know that the myelin sheath surrounds the axon and it provides insulation to the neuron so that the impulse can be quick. Because if some of the impulse is being lost exteriorly, if the myelin sheath is not there, it's going to slow down the impulse. So the myelin sheath helps to speed up the transmission of the impulse. And multiple sclerosis is a disorder in which the myelin sheath degenerates, and this causes impulses to be slow. And they like asking multiple sclerosis more than Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's does come up sometimes. Okay, and then please like and subscribe and leave any questions that you have down in the comment section, and I will get to them as soon as I can.